Uh, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dalit History Month lecture series 2005, led by Speaking from Margin. And I am Chettupally Anvesh. I'm a PhD candidate at Indian Languages and Literary Studies Department, University of Delhi. And I'm happy to be a moderator today. So today's talk is so special, and we have an amazing speaker to guide through the theme we have selected. And this series will definitely help us understood history from the views of the people who are often left out. And before going to the theme, before having a wonderful conversation with the speaker here, I would love to introduce the speaker and also the theme. And let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Malavika Binny. She is an historian, a professor, and a feminist, as mentioned in the poster as well. And she has a doctorate from JNU, New Delhi, where she studied history, focusing on people and power in old Kerala. And she won Elamkulam Kunjan Pillai Young Historian Prize in 2017 and studied at Leiden University in the Netherlands. And now she is an assistant professor and as well as head of the Department of History at Kannur University, Kerala. And she loves researching old records, writing essays for places like the conversation, and even directing plays as well. And she has visited around 32 countries and wants to write a novel about women's stories particularly. So I got a chance to meet her in person in Wayanad when I was presenting a paper in a Wayanad Literature Festival, and that was a very wonderful moment. I got to know about her works. I got to know about her achievements and how committed she was, how committed she is as well. Like she always keeps her department to be very active throughout the year, throughout the academic year, and even during the vacation time. Like you can see any kind of programs to be run by the Department of History under her guidance and under her with her coordination. And our topic today is towards an Ambedkarite history. This means like looking at history through the ideas of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and who fought for the equality and rights for Dalits as well, and like as humans, and others who were treated badly. So we need this talk because history books often ignores some of the stories, and I consider why this topic matters or why this topic is important is it helps to learn about Dalit struggles and even achievement that are usually left out in history. And Ambedkar's framework or ideas to make history fairer and more equal, and then how power and society affected Dalit lives in the past and in the present times. And it also encourages us to rethink history from the bottom up, not just from the bottom, not just from the top. And it connects the past injustice to today's fight for justice as well. So, Dr. Malavika Binny will definitely help us see how Ambedkar's vision can change how we understand the past, giving a voice to those who were silent for very too long. So, before starting the lecture, I would like to hand over this session to Dr. Malavika Binny about towards an Ambedkarite history. Ma'am, can you hear us, ma'am?
Yes, sorry, I lost connection in between.
Yeah, the floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Anvesh. I heard about half of what you're saying. I do not know whether I whether I deserve all the accolades, but I'm very, very thankful to Speaking from Margins and this particular initiative by Vidyasagar and Anvesh and others among you. I also feel very honored for having been opportunity to converse about Ambedkarite history with all of you. So as I understand, can you hear me? Am I audible? Am I audible now? Can you hear me? No.
Yes.
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, you are
Slight
audible.
disturbance, but it's audible, ma'am.
Can you hear? But the voice is breaking. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
The voice is breaking. 1 second. Let me try switching. Now, is it better now? Hello?
It is better now, ma'am. Yeah, it's better now, ma'am.
All right. As I gather, the format is that I talk for some time and then we move on to Q&A. Isn't it so? Okay, good. So I had actually thought of two different topics. One was Dalit knowledge production, particularly Dalit women's knowledge production, and the second was towards an Ambedkarite history. Now, both of these, that is Dalit knowledge production and Ambedkarite history, or having the need to move towards an Ambedkarite history is not divorced from one another. Because quite often, when you're in the academia or whether it's in popular discourse, what usually happens is, when you put these two words together, Dalit and knowledge, most people feel that this is an oxymoron because the way that knowledge has been understood and perceived, not shaped, fashioned, or constructed, but only in the way that knowledge has been perceived for centuries, maybe even millennia on the Indian subcontinent, is that it has been understood as the uh, preserve of a certain set of dominant caste people. And this is something that needs to be challenged because it's only very, very recently, as recent as maybe like, for instance, I am an ancient historian. When I look at history, I look at like 2000 years of history or 4000 years of history, or history starting from, let's say, the Harappan civilization. So if you take that long durée history of millennia of years, of centuries, then what you see is that the kind of manipulation or the kind of perception that knowledge has been the preserve of certain communities uh, is a very recent one. In fact, one can even refer to it as a colonial construct. For instance, if you look at medieval writings, you would see that other than in Sanskritic context, you would see different terms being used for knowledge. For instance, if you look at Buddhist and Jaina works, or if you look at the very rich oral tradition that we have in India, you not only have references to Jnana and Vijnana, which are the usual terms used for knowledge in the Sanskritic tradition, but you also have terms such as Bodha. Now, Bodha, very succinctly, the Brahminic communities have used it to refer to consciousness. But if you look at other vernacular context, particularly if you look at Buddhist vernaculars, you will see Bodha being used as the equivalent or a synonym for right knowledge or right kind of understanding. And this this sort of knowledge, this kind of knowledge which was skill-based, which was embodied, which was transferred intergenerationally by word of mouth, which is maybe part and parcel of the everyday lives of people, which would have been the knowledge that people identified with. This knowledge, if you look at it, or these streams of knowledges, because it's not just one kind of knowledge, it's a very plural set of knowledges that we have across the subcontinent, and maybe even beyond that, that was eclipsed when you move towards the colonial period. Because during the colonial period, what you see is, and scholars like Nicholas Dirks, for instance, and others like Romila Thapa, for instance, have looked at the and proposed this idea, which has been verified by generations of historians. Every generation of historians who look at translated editions of Sanskritic works, whether it is your Abhijnana Shakuntalam or whether it is the translation of Vedas by Kolberg, you take any number of Sanskrit works which have been translated, or even translations of Tagore for that matter, what you will see is that there is a certain kind of colonial gaze at work. But at the same time, it is not just a colonial gaze. It is a Brahmanic colonial gaze that is at work. Because who did the British go to for extraction of indigenous knowledge systems? It was the Brahmanic community. And you could also see the development, and it was not even a very slow emergence. It was like a more sporadic kind of nexus which came up, where you could see the Brahmin holding hands with the British to generate a new kind of hegemony, one which was also based on the extraction and formulation and distillation of indigenous knowledge into a mold which fit the colonial gaze. So an appropriate, now someone like Bodhi, for instance, who have written this brilliant book called Epistemology of the Oppressed. Now, if you have not read that book, it's a very thin book of about 50 pages or so. It's a must read for anyone who's trying to understand colonialism in India and how colonialism impacted the common people of India. In the epistemology of the oppressed, much like, epistemology of the marginalized. The title, of course, is based on Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire. Now, in this particular work, Epistemology of the Marginalized, Bodhi argues that if you look at the process of coloniality, one of the integral ways in which colonialism perched itself on casteism in India was through manipulating knowledge, was through declaring only one set of knowledge or one set of language as being the particular language of knowledge, one set of knowledge as being Indian knowledge. And what I was trying to say is that generations of Indian scholars who have worked with translations of Sanskritic works have already, wherever you have an introduction to any work, any historical work, which is based on a translation, they will discover for themselves that what you see in it is, on the one hand, this heavy cultural nationalist narrative, where there is this constant emphasis on India having been this glorious land in the past. And here the past is a reference to the ancient past. Then and then what will they use? They will use European parameters to argue that the Indian past was great. So, for instance, if you have an argument that Athens was the mother of democracy, then Indian scholars like R.G. Bhandarkar or R.C. Majumdar would argue that no, in India we had the Janapadas, and the Janapadas were the root of democracy. That is where democracy actually took birth. Now, one can, of course, debate whether Janapadas were democratic at all, or whether they can be referred to as republics. Now, you do have scholars like V.D. Mahajan who have referred to it as republics. Now, those are all debatable. But then, the kind of objective analysis that we associate with post-Rankian history, that is something that was near totally missing in nationalist narratives. Now, but one can also give them a little bit of leeway, or concede to the fact that they were writing history during the national struggle, and they were struggling against a lot of extremely utilitarian colonial narratives which were constructed by the British. Uh, and when you look at these extremely orientalist and utilitarian narratives about India, which were shaped by British writings, one would see that there was a certain projection of the people of India and the Indian subcontinent, not only as a miasmic region, but also as a very effeminate region, also as a very passive region. And they would argue that it is because Indians believed in fatalism, it is because Indians believed in passivity, that you did not have the industrial revolution here, that Indians lacked the initiative to further business interest, to further industrial interest, so on and so forth. No, but it is very curious to me as a student of history, and as someone who teaches history, and this is a question which came to me when I was doing my MPhil, and I was working on power and identities in pre-modern Kerala, and I was reading text after text after text, and it got to a point where all the historiography that I had, historiography is the history of history writing, where we read other historians and we try to understand what their perspectives on history are. So the current historiography till that point of time, whether I'm reading Romila Thapar, or whether I'm reading R.S. Sharma, or whether I'm reading Ranabir Chakravarti, yes, they were very useful for me, but I got to a point where I couldn't move forward. And then I couldn't also understand, why is it that I am not able to move forward? I'm reading this text, I am using methodology, I'm doing everything that a history student or a history researcher is supposed to do, but I am not able to find answers to questions like how were bodies understood and classified? Why did the Brahmanical system think that it is necessary to classify bodies? Why is it that treatment is only prescribed for certain diseases and for certain people? And then I understood that this is because till that, till that point of time, the question of caste was not being addressed in Indian historiography. And that is where years ago, I had attended a seminar on Ambedkar, and suddenly it came back to me that, hello, there is a person who has actually worked on caste. He might not be there in my university syllabus, but unless and until I give him a read, maybe I'll not understand this. And that is when I started looking at Ambedkar's text. And as a young MPhil student, when I started reading Ambedkar's text, I started off with Annihilation of Caste, and then I moved on to Who Are the Shudras, then I moved on to Untouchables. And each page of it was truly a revelation to me, because it gave me more answers to the questions that I was seeking, but more importantly, it also made me ask newer questions. And that was when that was when I started asking my professors why you do not have Ambedkar on the syllabus. And of course, my professors said, of course, you can read it. Ambedkar is something that we think that students would have already read. They gave you all these answers. So I kept on reading Ambedkar, whether they liked it or not. But none of them discouraged me from reading Ambedkar, which is a plus point. But at the same time, none of them also encouraged me to read Ambedkar. But Ambedkar also gave me a breakthrough, because it is in Ambedkar and it is in one of his most easy works. Now, Ambedkar's works are not easy to read. You would have to give them time, you would have to take effort. Because Ambedkar, unlike a lot of other scholars, is reading with very complex issues. He's dealing with extremely complex issues. His writing is extremely layered. So it will take time. But if you put in that time, it will be extremely fulfilling for you. Because if you are someone who's dealing with Indian history, if you're someone who's dealing with Indian sociology, if you're someone who's dealing with Indian foreign policy, if you do not read Ambedkar, your research will be poorer. That is what I have understood from my personal research. So, so the first work that I read was Annihilation of Caste, and as I was reading it, it became very crystal clear to me, because Ambedkar very clearly says that if you look at Indian history, caste is not based on profession. So I had all these other historians who were time and again harping on the point that caste is based on profession. But the texts that I was looking at as a researcher, which were Ayurvedic texts, which were Vastu Shastra texts, was not giving me that was not telling me that caste is based on profession. There were other kinds of schemata at work. Now, because I had a particular kind of historical training, which made me think that caste is based on profession, and I'm looking at these texts with this particular idea that caste is based on profession, I couldn't get a breakthrough. Now, once I read Ambedkar in Annihilation of Caste, and I understood that caste is ritual status. And this one statement, which Ambedkar proves through this extremely interesting anecdote. Now, he asked, so if, let's say, caste was based on profession, what is the profession of Kshatriya women? The Kshatriya men go to war, and because they go to war, they can be called as Kshatriyas. Now, if you had a formulation that Kshatriya is equal to warrior, then Kshatriya women should also go to war. Or Kshatriya women should not be called as Kshatriya women. Now, if you are saying that all priests are Brahmins, then you should let Brahmin women worship in temples, become priests in temples. Why are you not letting Brahmin women become priests in temples? See, this is something that Ambedkar wrote in 1936. You can still apply it to issues such as the Sabrimala issue in Kerala in 2023. See, that is the kind of relevance that Ambedkarite ideas of history still has. Now, that's a caveat. But for me, what was significant was this idea that caste is ritual status. And then when I went back and looked at my text, things became way more clear to me. And one could see that the construction of identities in ancient India, the construction of identities in medieval India was done not through the proliferation of professions, or what we in because of our history training, what we refer to as craft specialization, because that is the usual causality that is given for the proliferation of caste. So you would have a set of historians who would say that when you have more and more professions coming up, when society becomes more and more complex because of demographic growth, you have the proliferation of jati. Now, Ambedkar, on the other hand, would say the proliferation of jati does not happen because of that. The proliferation of the jati happens because you have the emergence of the empire, and for the empire to control and regulate population, you would need a certain kind of hierarchy. And that hierarchy has to be legitimized through a religious apparatus. And that religious apparatus would use rituality and the provision of ritual legitimacy and ritual status to certain groups, while taking away ritual status and ritual provision from other, and thereby subjugating entire sets of people under this hierarchy, so that resource extraction would happen very conveniently, and there would actually be an ideological apparatus which the people would be subject to. So the smooth running of the empire, so the smooth governance of the empire and tax extraction would happen by ritually assimilating a certain set of people who might have been forest tribes, who might have been nomadic tribes, under the larger aegis of what we refer to today as Puranic Hinduism. So you see that there's this big difference, one which acknowledges caste and one which does not acknowledge caste. And in the Indian context, if you acknowledge caste and if you understand caste as a ritual status, it's a I would say it's a simple understanding, but it is also a very layered understanding. So once you move away from that framework, and this is just one of the things that you would pick from Ambedkar's writings. So if you move away from the conventional understanding of caste as one which is based on professional division or division of labor, to that of caste being the result of ritual status, you can actually have a very, very novel, very, very fresh way of looking at the ancient past itself. Now, as we proceed with Ambedkar's idea of history, more and more things about how nations emerge, for instance, how state is understood in the global south, how, for instance, you have broken men and surplus men, and how that in turn leads to very gendered ways of social ordering, and how in turn that leads to very to the spatial ordering of cities and villages in India. Those are things that becomes very, very evident when you look at Ambedkar. Now, but in Indian historiography, what has also happened is, now I am also someone who teaches this, but whenever I teach it, I also think, why is it that we also don't go beyond the syllabus and talk to students about other newer streams of history? But this is not even a new stream of history. So in my history classes, what we teach is that we have 4 schools of history. You have the colonial school of history, within which you have the Orientalist school. Now, the Orientalist school would appreciate India while being subject to the colonial gaze. You had the utilitarian school, which would completely adhere to a colonial interest. And then once you have the national struggle, you have the emergence of nationalist history writing. And then you have the Marxist school of history. And then you have the subaltern school of history. Full stop. That's how we teach our students, and according to Muslims. But one of the I do not know how to put it, but even if I get into controversy, I'm still going to say this. One of the biggest banes of that subaltern historiography has brought to history, the discipline in India, and to the way that history is taught across universities and colleges in India, is the fact that it has absolutely subsumed Ambedkarite history. So much so that one can actually not delineate subaltern history and Ambedkarite history in university curricula now. And what has it also led to? It led to this idea that subaltern historiography will, of course, cover all those themes which has been negated a space in mainstream history writing. But if you look at subaltern historiography, if you look at subaltern studies theories, what will you see? You will see that you do have referential historiography of, let's say, the tribals. You have references to minorities. You have references to historical processes which have otherwise not been part of Marxist, national, or colonial historiography. But what is peculiarly absent, what is conspicuously absent, is the presence of subaltern scholars who are from, let's say, Dalit backgrounds or Bahujan backgrounds, or tribal backgrounds as authors of these texts. And even if you look at the perspective that is employed in the set of text which we refer to as subaltern studies text, you would see that though there is a different gaze, one which is different from the nationalist gaze, one which is different from the Marxist gaze, it is still very much informed by the Marxist gaze. It is still very informed by the anti-colonial gaze. But again, what is conspicuously missing is the fact that you do not see a Dalit gaze. You do not see a non-elitist gaze. In fact, what is being used as sources here, it is the same archives which is being used here, but there's a certain kind of reading against the grain. How much do they employ oral traditions? Are they taking into account Dalit folklore? Are they taking into account tribal stories? Is anthropology being used? Now, not the kind of colonial anthropology that has plagued academia for years and continues to plague it, but do they employ barefoot anthropology, for instance? Do they employ grassroots anthropology? Unfortunately, the answer to most of these questions is not in the affirmative. What are the topics that have been taken up by subaltern studies? You would see constant narrative through subaltern historiography is a certain kind of struggle between the marginalized and the state. But if you look at Dalit histories, if you look at Buddhist histories, for instance, or if you look at tribal histories, they have survived, or they have lived, or they have celebrated, or they have had lives which were not informed by the colonial narrative. Now, for instance, if you take a tribe like the Kurchia tribe, for instance. Now, if somebody is going to write a subaltern history of the Kurchia tribe, it would start with the Kurchia struggle against the British, as if the Kurchia tribe did not have an existence before the British. It would not explore the pre-modern history of the Kurchia tribe. And it would refrain from using the Kurchia tribe's internal epistemology in understanding itself. Now, a dismissal of internal epistemes of whichever marginalized community that they have used is something that you see throughout subaltern studies. But because subaltern studies have had such a huge impact on history writing, particularly in terms of historical method, most people who work with or work on tribal themes or Dalit themes or marginalized themes in general think that they have to employ the subaltern historiographical method. When Ambedkar has shown us that you can actually use an Ambedkarite method. You can actually use a method where you do not have to be informed by the state. You do not have to be informed by the colonial archives. You can use people's understanding about themselves. This is what Ambedkar has done with a lot of Buddhist texts. You can see, now today we have a term called hermeneutics, where we use the internal logic of a text to understand the text. We do not place it in the context of the present, which would make it anachronistic, but we would locate the text in its own times, interrogate why the text was written, for who the text was produced, who would have been the possible audience of that particular historical text, how would it have been circulated, what were the means of the production of these texts, did it change media from, let's say, oral tradition to the written version, or was it also reflected in murals, did it become part of performative acts? So there's an entire gamut of things that we explore under hermeneutics. But the core idea of hermeneutics remains: how do we understand the text using its own internal logic? Now, this is something that you will see in Ambedkar's writings. Now, he does not use the term hermeneutics because the term hermeneutics came much later. But if you will look at, let's say, Ambedkar's theory on the Shudra, now when he uses the Manusmriti, and this is very, very rare, and this is where I feel that we have done a huge disservice to history by not looking at Ambedkar. Sometimes we think of it like, oh, we have avoided Ambedkar in history writing. But who has lost by avoiding and omitting Ambedkar in historiography? It is not Ambedkar. Ambedkar continued producing more and more works, and Ambedkar will be read as long as there is in India. And I would even say Ambedkar would be read as long as there is oppression in this world. Because in order to understand how to resist oppression, you have to, one of the most integral texts that you have to read is, of course, Ambedkar. But who has lost the discipline of history has lost so much by not looking at Ambedkarite works. And what is also surprising for me is that if you look at R. Sharma's work on the Shudras, for instance, you would see that there's a lot of semblance to what Ambedkar is arguing about the Shudras. For instance, the way that spatial ordering happened in cities and villages in India, Ambedkar uses the term broken men, for instance, where prisoners of war or the survivors of war would be integrated into the territories of the victors of war as protectors or as people who would look out for other people in terms of them being sentinels or soldiers, and they would always be housed on the outskirts of the village. Now, this was also because they could not they could not be made to be part of the mainstream village because they came from elsewhere. So that kind of a distinction was maintained, but their labor was still being extracted. No, Ambedkar also found a very practical implication to this particular theory, which you would also find in R. Sharma, but in other words, where Ambedkar, and then you would see this in his works when he is also writing about a Bhima Koregaon, where when the British started, initially, if you look at British recruitment practices in India, you would see that it was from Dalit communities in particular that you have recruitment to the Indian army. And this was because largely the dominant caste or the oppressor caste would stay away from the army, think that, oh, we would have to live in the army barracks, and this would mean that we would have to stay with other people. So they distanced themselves from the Indian army in the initial years. But once it was understood that this was a highly remunerative job as compared to, let's say, other jobs, and there was a certain kind of dignity that was being given to certain groups of people who had joined the army, they changed their position and they started to as a you have several records which indicate that as a community they had taken this decision to be part of the army. But at the same time, you also see official British correspondence saying that that for the army to grow and the army to have what they refer to as respectability, it would be good to have more and more non-Dalit groups within the army. So it's happening from both sides. And it was when Ambedkar analyzed this particular scenario, Ambedkar is very aptly arguing that, this whole idea that martial castes, martial groups can only be found in among the Rajputs. That the military was always manned by people who belong to oppressor caste. This whole supposition is wrong. Because if you look at Indian history, you would always see that the people who guarded the village, they were broken men who came from other tribes or broken men who came from other groups who were settled on the outskirts of the village. And most often, these people later on became part of the Dalit community. So he is looking at the broken men from a sociological angle, but he's also addressing the same phenomena when he's looking at the Indian army or the British, in this case, the British Indian army. He's also looking at it from a political angle. And this is something that you would see throughout Ambedkar's writings, where he's not writing in vacuum. He's not only looking at one single source. He's looking at multiple sources. And then he's also looking at the ramifications of particular historical phenomena from multiple angles. This is something that you see very, very late in mainstream Indian historiography. Like, it is today that we talk about transdisciplinarity and multidisciplinarity. It's something which is integral in Ambedkar's writing. It is something that you can apply when you're studying, let's say, military history of India. And it is something that you can apply if you're looking at history from a let's say, a sociological angle. Now, the larger point here is that when you go through when you go through Ambedkar's own writings and writings of those who have followed Ambedkar, now whether it is Gopal Guru or whether it is Vivekananda Cha writing on untouchability, you would see that there is a clear distinction between the ways that subaltern historiography have looked at people of India, historical processes in India, and the sociology of India, and how Ambedkarite history looks at it. And that is why I propose that one has to actually think of Ambedkarite history also as a method and a methodology. It is not just a set of texts that Ambedkar has produced. It's a methodology that each of us can use. One which tries to analyze history from the point of the most marginalized. Because if you're looking at, let's say, a theory that, like the surplus men, surplus women theory that Ambedkar has produced, Ambedkar is positing that theory from the vantage point of the most vulnerable. And who is the most vulnerable here? It is the surplus women who are considered to be in excess. And what happens to them? They either become victims of sati, or on the other hand, if you have surplus men in a society, what would happen is they would be married off as child brides. Now, this idea that in a society, if you have excess men or excess women, that one particular community which is thought to be in excess should be the one which is which should be considered as the one which needs to be eliminated. But that doesn't happen. Why that doesn't happen in India? It would have happened in other countries where you did not have caste. Now, for X, Y, Z community, if a set of people are in excess, how would you usually think? You would think of eliminating maybe that set of people, isn't it so? But if you're looking at the surplus men / surplus women theory, you would see that it is not that that community, whichever community it is, which is thought to be eliminated. Rather, what would happen when men are in excess in a particular caste group, and that is where, if you do not add caste to the analysis, your analysis becomes very, very reductive, because caste is that all pervasive phenomena that has pervaded and plagued all kinds of other phenomena in India. So when in a particular caste group you have number of men in excess of number of women, the solution that that particular historical situation resorts to is to have those men marry women who are younger and way below the age of consent. Why? Otherwise, these men will go and look for brides from other castes, which would lead to a breakdown of endogamy, which would lead to caste being questioned. So that caste remains as a watertight compartment, rather than letting these men marry women from other caste. You would make the men marry women who are underage. So where does the problem of child marriage stem from? The answer is very, very simple: because of caste. Now you have hundreds of other papers which look for other kinds of causalities for caste, but for Ambedkar it is very, very clear. And on the other hand, when you have excess women, what do? Now, to prevent these excess women from, let's say, having unions or having marriages with men from other caste, you would eliminate them through sati. And for oppressor caste, this was particularly significant. Why? Because there was also a question of property. Now, if these women married men from other communities, there would also be a transfer of property. There was a question of generationality, because it was through the identity of the father that the caste of the child was ascertained. So, but this is not just a question, not just a question of caste. Ambedkar is also addressing gender here, because in both these cases, which community is the most vulnerable community? Which community is taking which gender is taking the brunt of the processes at work here? It is again women. So it is by constantly positioning oneself from the vantage point of the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, that Ambedkar found most of his answers. Now you would see this in his interrogation of the untouchables. Now, when he is arguing or when he is exploring the history of untouchability, he is not looking at them as objects, as most historians do. He is not analyzing only the phenomena of untouchability, or he is not analyzing how caste system led to forced integration of certain sets of tribes into a pre-existing hierarchy, which is the kind of postulation that most historians have done. Rather, Ambedkar is trying to dissect these texts, whether it is your Yajnavalkya Smriti or whether it is your Manusmriti. Ambedkar is trying to dissect those texts and go beyond those texts and say that, see, this phenomena that you refer to as untouchability is not a single unified phenomena, because you do not see a single Manu. That Manusmriti, this work itself is not the work of a single person. In fact, you will see multiple Manus. So what is being done here is a discrediting of those works, which imposed untouchability. So it is not dissecting a text for the text's sake or for history's sake. It is taking away the credibility of a text which historians for centuries have thought to be the central text of a Sanskritic universe. Now, years later, when Vivekananda is looking at the question of untouchability, he would say the same, that Manusmriti had not reached South India. When did you and I learn about Manusmriti? Did we learn about Manusmriti through the British or before the British? It was other kinds or other patterns of caste which were at work, because there was no single united Hinduism at that point of time, or Sanatana Dharma, however you want to call it. You would not see that, let's say, in the 16th or the 17th century. One cannot premise one's argument about caste based on, let's say, one set of text, whether it is the Shruti text or the Smriti text. Rather, you would have to interrogate the historical evolution of caste through other mechanism, and not just the textual tradition. There were other patterns of legitimization at work. And that is where Ambedkar would point to the South, particularly to the Tamils, and say that, you have an entire history of Naga worship here. And if you look at Naga history, you would see that many different kinds of priesthoods, many types, many different patterns of worship, many different types of classification which did not subscribe to the Brahmanic way of classification was present. This was also because the kind of seasons that you see in the peninsula part of the country, or in the southern part of the country, the kind of crops which are grown here, the kind of deities who were worshipped, were very, very different to the ones that you see in the north. And one could also see that South India have had a pre-Puranic Hinduism past, where you could see the heavy influence of Buddhism, where you could see the heavy influence of Jainism. In fact, if you look at the sites that have been, let's say, unearthed for the last 50, 60 years or so, one would see that we have unearthed more than 100 sites which can very clearly be identified as belonging to the Sramana traditions. And then if you move even further south, if you look at Sri Lanka, it's a living example of the fact that you had possibilities of having governing apparatuses as well, which did not use Puranic Hinduism as its legitimizing mechanism or as its ideological apparatus. So what does one see at work here? That there is a possibility of addressing sources which are not Sanskritic in nature. I'm not saying that we have to let go of all the Sanskritic sources, but this way of thinking of the Sanskrit sources as the most significant text and all other sources, whether it is oral tradition or Buddhist Jaina text or other texts, like, let's say, for instance, text of Ayurveda, text of Arthashastra, as corollaries. This is what Ambedkar is critiquing here by taking away the uh, credibility of texts such as Manusmriti. This whole idea of the Vedas or the Smritis being aparusheya, that they have not changed over time. It was kind of a sacrosanct truth, truth within inverted commas, of course, that was not questioned in Ambedkar. Now, Ambedkar comes on the scene and questions the Vedas and says that, how can you claim that this is sacrosanct, that this has remained the same? And then he looks at three different versions of the Vedas and says that, you see immense kinds of changes happening. Then he compares them to the Ramayana and Mahabharata and says that what you see in the Veda, you do not see in the Ramayana and Mahabharata. There is no one lineage for Puranic Hinduism. That there is immense. If you read his text, Riddles in Hinduism, it's a very simple. Unlike a lot of other texts, this is a very simple text, which is written in very simple language by Ambedkar. If you look at riddles in Hinduism, you would see that he brings out through each riddle, he brings out the contradictions within what we perceive to be one single unified Puranic Hindu religion, which later on we identified as the religion of Hinduism. So it is through this exploration of internal contradiction, it is through this constant positioning of the historian from the vantage point of the most marginalized. It is through not only dissecting but also taking away the sacrosanct nature or the ideas of divinity attributed to texts that Ambedkarite historiography has progressed. And that is where we need to say out very, very loudly that you do have a distinct school of history that you can see in Ambedkar. And that might be the school that we need to follow. If we are to write grassroots histories, if we want to actually explore the life of the subaltern, if we want to actually look at Indian history through a non-Brahmanic, non-colonial, non-nationalist gaze, then that is the path that we need to follow. Because otherwise, we'll constantly be informed by the racist, Brahmanical, heteronormative, nationalist gaze, which is not, I wouldn't say that has not gone forward, but it has been a monodimensional gaze. It has been largely a monolithic gaze. And unfortunately, it is the kind of rhetoric that has also led to the production of textbooks. And this line of thinking, which has led to the production of textbooks, whether it is school textbook or college textbook, has also led to a situation where Ambedkar and Ambedkarite history is dismissed from the textbooks. That is why you will not see references to Ambedkar other than as a social reformer, other than as, let's say, the father of Indian Constitution in these textbooks. Why is Ambedkar not also introduced as a historian? Why is Ambedkar not also introduced as a sociologist? Now, you would have students being encouraged to look at glimpses of world history. You and I know of this text. The minute I say this, most of you would have immediately thought of Nehru. Because we learned of that in school. We had at least an excerpt from it in school, or it was mentioned as extra reading. Why was annihilation of caste or waiting for visa not made part of, let alone essential reading list? Why not at least a supplementary reading? Now, this is not an innocent act. Because, because it's the state which produces textbooks. The state wants us to have a state-centric view of academics in general. And since, probably by 10th, 12th standards, people stop, or unfortunately, people stop thinking about history. So if you do not have Ambedkar's writings or excerpts from Ambedkar in your school textbooks, a huge disservice which is being done here is that you're also not introducing students to a different perspective about Indian history. I'm not saying one should adhere absolutely only to Ambedkarite history. But if you are someone who is engaged in the business of knowledge production, you have a duty to inform your students, or inform the nation's students, inform the nation's educational curricula that there is another perspective, a perspective which credits the marginalized, which looks at history not just from history and historical processes, not just from a grassroots level, but looks at larger macro narratives as well, but stations themselves always and always through a non-Brahmanical gaze. Now, if you do not actually engage in that, a huge problem, which is what we are facing now, we will also not be equipping our students with thinking tools. We will still be plagued by the colonial level of thinking, where the dominant will be understood as the powerful, and the dominant and the majoritarian will be understood to be right, will be understood to be the ones whose interests should be safeguarded. So what we need today, if you're and that is why I felt that, titling this particular talk as Towards Ambedkarite History uh, would be the most apt, because one actually has to go back, not just go back to Ambedkar, because there's a lot of going back to Ambedkar which has happened in the last 10 years or so, but that is unfortunately, as still Anand Teljumde in his recent work Iconoclast have pointed out, it has led to the iconization of Ambedkar. But what we need today is not the iconization of Ambedkar. What we need is an engagement with Ambedkarite historiography. What we need today is an engagement with Ambedkar's vision, which unfortunately have not unfolded yet. So since we're near five, I have taken 5 minutes more than what was permitted to me. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So years ago, I read a translation about Ambedkar, where the introduction and the blurb, the writer who wrote it stated that Ambedkar, he himself is an history, because whatever he wrote in his books, in his writings, is not just a mere piece of writing or any sort of writing, but it's more of proper research. It's more of reading history from different perspectives, from different lens. And again, loved it hearing from your end, ma'am. And thank you very much for this wonderful insightful session, actually. And would love to hand over this session to everyone who have, like, for Q&A. The floor is open for questions, and anyone willing to go for any question, and it's open for you. And
Uh, thank you so much, Malavika. If I may, uh, uh, this is really like we are really looking forward for discussion. That's why we are also like pushing so much to come and speak. So I have, a couple of questions which I'm still struggling with my own research. So I'm looking, I'm working on the sociology of belonging among Dalit Bahujan students in especially in higher education. So I was interviewing a girl. She come from a scheduled caste background from Maharashtra, and she wanted to be a museologist because she has been trained in history and she wants to be do some critical research in museology and particularly looking the archives which directly relates with Dalit history and subaltern history. So I was interviewing her and I asked this question, why did you choose to become a museology? And then she told me, so there are disciplines, there are methods where our touch defines what we can do, what we cannot. So there are bodies of belonging for us. So there are archive, there are monograph documents, and when I go to that museum or that archive to access, that person or that admin staff asked my name. I told my name, and she said, no, this is not accessible. So when you see such discipline where very much rooted with this notion of it's deeply embedded with the question of caste and your identity. So I want your reflection because I was reading your couple of works, especially your thesis, and and we have also other example from Jawaharlal University where history and especially CHS has been one of the most a disciplinary pedagogical place where this sort of Brahminical historiography has been such embedded in especially in Indian history writing. So, and there are a couple of other historian wrote who come from the marginal background, other subaltern identities, and they were very vocal about that. And Jadavpur's case is, I must be familiar with that case. But her thesis had been denied, and they have asked to rewrite her thesis because certain things she wanted to write, which goes against the so-called historical methods. So how do you see a young researcher or young mind who's wanted to study like Dalit history or want to do some archive research, but the discipline and the method is so bounded by this sort of caste notion. So what you would say to that girl if you have been space to say something to her? So that's my question to you. Thank you so much, but it's really really such a provocative uh, point for us to think and reflect. Thank you so much, Malika.
I would ask your friend or your informant to go ahead and then do what she's doing now, because you know what you see is that now if you take gender for instance, it is because of the influx of young women into the academia around from 1950s to 1960s that widened the discursive limits of a lot of disciplines, whether it is anthropology or sociology, or even let's say a field like genetics. When you have female geneticists entering the fray, it is then that they started thinking about, oh, what is the purpose of the egg? How do these chromosomes actually work? Which chromosomes lead to the housekeeping gene? These are questions that women started asking because it was also significant for them. This whole idea of the egg being passive and the sperm being the mobile element, these were questioned by female biologists. What you see in India and what you're seeing across the world now is an influx of Dalit Bahujan scholars, Dalit Bahujan tribal scholars who are asking these questions which have not been asked till now. And it is not for their sake, or it is not for the sake of those marginalized communities that those questions need be asked. It is for the sake of the discipline and for the discipline to remain relevant. So if history has to remain relevant, if sociology has to remain relevant, those questions need to be asked. Now, whether it is about the corporeality of caste or whether it is about the intersections of materiality and caste. For instance, I have a paper coming up which is on which is on caste artifacts. So these are caste-based artifacts. How usually from the Western academia, people keep asking you, so how do you know whether a person is Dalit or not? Now the easy answer uh, is the fact that if you're from an oppressor caste, most people will let you know. Ajanta Subramaniam, for instance, says in her work that in 5 minutes of talking to a Tambram, they'll tell you. So So one of the identity markers that we particularly have for oppressor caste is language as a discourse. But you also have a caste discourse which is based on materiality, which is based on artifacts. So it was the use and the production of certain kinds of materials, but when I say this, immediately one's mind goes to, let's say, leather, or let's say beef. But it's not just that. No, why are we not thinking about the punul or the janus? So when I say that there is interconnections between actual material, tangible artifacts and caste, why is it that we not think of, let's say, a tuft of hair known as the kuduma and the Brahmin community? Our gaze veers towards those sets of people who are oppressed. But caste markers are there. They are there in your curiosity cabinets, or what you call as showcases. And we exhibit them, whether it is your Beetle books, whether it is your gramophone, whether it is all those things that we refer to as heritage or antique objects now, which have become, or which have transformed themselves. I don't know whether they're completely transformed, but there's a certain kind of morphosis which has happened, where they have morphed into objects of grandeur, and they still occupy spaces of significance in our visiting rooms. So the format of caste change, there's this larger theory that I'm working on, where where I try to use this concept which I borrowed from the physical sciences, called as metachronosis, which is this idea that, the caste ordering might remain the same, but the ways in which caste manifests itself, that might change. So let's say today a Brahmin who's sitting in the US, who's not supposed to actually cross the seas, has crossed the seas, but he or she or they can still retain their Brahmin identity. And how would one do it? You would have, let's say, him wearing a particular kind of mark on his forehead, or through, let's say, wearing one particular element of what might be regarded by the Americans as an ethnic marker, but which makes clear to the Indian diaspora his, her, or their caste identity. So, metachronosis is this idea of how caste kind of metamorphosis from one kind of let's say one modality of functioning to another modality of function, while remaining, while while its internal ordering, while its internal hierarchy is maintained. So all of these questions are questions which are emerging now, which have emerged in the last 20 years or so. And it is thanks not just to movements which have happened within the academia, it is thanks to movements which have happened in India. For instance, the political movements of the Dalit Bahujans, which have actually pushed the academia to think in ways which it was reluctant to do so. Because the academia has also remained as a largely hierarchical space. And it is only through the entry of not just people who belong to marginalized backgrounds, but also thoughts, visions, and ideas and epistemes that have been recovered by these scholars, that have undeniably found themselves located in the academia, that cannot actually be overlooked now. So for me, it is very, very significant for young scholars from various backgrounds, not just marginalized backgrounds, to also look at those huge gaps that we have. And those are knowledge gaps. And those knowledge gaps can only be filled not just by asking those questions, by dealing with different kind of sources, the museal objects that you were referring to. And for that, you need discourses of resistance. So if somebody says you cannot touch the object, I would go and file a complaint. And I would post on social media for sure, saying that I am being denied access. If the Indian Constitution gives me access to a particular object, then I need to be given access to that particular. I'm not saying that it's an easy task, but somebody has to take up the task. Now, you have a very renowned Bahujan social activist from the early 1900s in Kerala. He's called Sahodaran Ayyappan. He worked with Narayana Guru. He was one of the first rationalist scholars from Kerala. So he has made this very interesting statement about knowledge. He says that, this extra burden of educating and making enlightened the Savarna has fallen on the shoulders of the Avarna. So this extra burden, according to him, this extra burden comprises of making him, and he uses the term him, so I'm going to stick with him. So this extra burden comprises of two tasks. One is making the oppressor know that he is oppressing. Because oppression has become very normal to them. Oppression has become very routine to them that they do not even know that they're engaged in oppression. So the first task is to make them realize that what they are doing is oppression. Second is to make the ignorant oppressor aware about the fact that his knowledge itself is oppressive, and that there are other forms of knowledge which are not so oppressive. So that extra burden unfortunately falls on the shoulders of these young Dalit, Bahujan, female Adivasi scholars. It's a historical task that we have to take up. Is it fair? No, it is not fair. It is an extra burden.
There is a question in the chat, ma'am, from Dev Datta. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture, ma'am. Can you please shed light regarding B.R. Ambedkar's take on intersectionality?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and very much what I do. If you read, for instance, Shailaja Paik's recent work on the vulgarity of caste, it's an excellent work. She talks about how Ambedkar has used, I think it is in her introduction, intersectionality without using the term of intersectionality, of course, where he has, yes, and now if you have read it, you would see that when she explores this idea of the tamasha women, she gives credit to Ambedkar for looking at women, I think it was the Devadasi women, or women who were temple women, or service caste, who also had to undertake sex work as part of their ritual labor. Now, initially, if you look at Ambedkar's writings, and even in Shailaja Paik's earlier work, you would see her critiquing Ambedkar for taking a sort of very moralistic stand, and arguing that the pride of Dalit men from that particular community was also getting hurt, because these women were also engaging in acts which were akin to ritual sex work, or maybe ritual sex work itself. But in her later works, you would see Shailaja Paik arguing that no, this is not what Ambedkar was trying to say, where Ambedkar was actually trying to probe how this question of generational intersectionality is at work. How, when you have certain customs which force women into certain kind of jobs, being associated with the larger agamic tradition, meaning the temple based tradition. How, on the one hand, you have questions of livelihood. On the other hand, you also have questions of women's agency. Because if you very closely look at these communities, you will see that it is the women who have more agency among these communities, which cannot be denied. But at the same time, this particular agency that they possess is also because they have positioned themselves slightly better off than the men in that community, but using the mechanisms that are provided to them through the process of agamization. So ultimately, what is also at work is that they are becoming part of the same apparatus which is enslaving them. And it is only by cutting off themselves from being part of that agamic tradition that one can find liberation from it. Because if you are part of it, even though it is providing you contextual and very what is the term for it, a very loose kind of agency, which is not defined and which cannot be effectively used for, let's say, liberation from either patriarchy or caste. But the kind of ephemerality that you have, this ephemeral nature of caste, will also disguise the kind of gendered agency that these women might have possessed. So it is only through moving away or distancing or completely cutting oneself off that one could actually position oneself uh, in a self where one could question caste, and that is probably the reason why Ambedkar asked women of that particular community to move away from that particular ritual sex work tradition that they had. Now, this is the kind of, so when Ambedkar is looking at it, he's looking at questions of livelihood, he's looking at questions of gender, not just one gender. You can see him reflecting on how this particular uh, this particular ritual work has an impact on the male of the community and the female of the community. He's also looking at questions of class, and he's also looking at the question of how they are positioned within the larger structure of the religion. You would also see how he's also looking at how all of this is in turn connected with the larger politics of the Indian national struggle, as well as the way in which social reform was understood during that particular time. And this is something that you would see throughout Ambedkar's writing. Now, whether we are looking at it using Kimberly Crenshaw's idea of intersectionality, or whether we are using Patricia Hill Collins' idea of standpoint epistemology, is something that you see throughout Ambedkar's writings, because there's this constant back and forth of using stories, using ideas, using let's say history from below. That is something that you see throughout Ambedkar's writing. But then he also kind of reconciles this standpoint epistemology with other kinds of historiographical practices, such as the Buddhist idea of historiographical practice of, let's say, integrating the spiritual, the religious with the material. So I've seen a lot of scholars argue that Ambedkar's writings are follow kind of a historical materialist approach, but I would say no. Even before Ambedkar embraced Buddhism, you would see a certain kind of historiography at work in Ambedkar, which is very, very Buddhist in its inclination, where whenever he's talking about the material, he's always linking the material to the spiritual. Now, this is something that you can very clearly see in Buddha or Marx, but you can also see it in his other works, particularly his later works, ones which are produced maybe after 1947, where you would see he is looking at other kinds of sources. And when the more that he's looking at Pali sources, the more he's also trying to maybe shape a Indian way of history writing. Now, unfortunately, because a lot of Ambedkar's works have been lost to us, maybe we have also lost a work where he fully formulated that. But if you read his later workings, you will also see this. So I would argue that yes, you would see intersectionality, but he also goes much beyond intersectionality. And probably that is the way that we also need to move ahead, where today when we understand intersectionality, we have a limited understanding of it as looking at multiple modes of expression and how they intersect with one another. But in Ambedkar, you will see not just multiple modes of oppression intersecting with one another when he analyzes marginalized communities. You would also see him locating the same in larger meta-narratives, like the meta-narrative of nationalism, for instance, the meta-narrative of Buddhism, for instance. So it is only when we look at these larger processes at work would intersectionality itself become more effective, I feel, as a historical tool. Otherwise, it would be a tool which is reduced, let's say, helping us understand gender or helping us understand caste in its own. But we also need to also integrate it, weave it together with other discourses. I hope I have answered you.
Anyone, any questions?
This happens to me quite often. I feel I intimidate people.
I'll go with the one, man. Like, as a person who have watched your episode with beer biceps as well, I wanted to ask few questions. So I was these days I'm afraid to go to the comment section. How people were so ignorant to know the truth. And you have spoken about inclusivity, and you have spoken about history being correct, history being read or included even in curriculum, and even read by the people. I mean the researchers, even in academics. So when you spoke about caste being not caste being just attributed to the profession, though their texts don't say that actually. Even referring to Yajnavalka's Shastras or Yajnavalka's Vedas in his writings as well. So it's a clearly, it's not about profession. But still people claim that it's only about profession, not to the birth or not to anything else. So now we are talking about inclusivity and proper reading of history, and many of them are completely ignorant to know the truth, ignorant to accept the truth. And I have understood that going through the comment section in the same Beer Vices episode, because they are not aware of the things that you're talking about, and still they want to bluntly strike them off, saying that this is not the history, this is not the truth that we have been taught. And maybe this, as you mentioned, like this history did not have any influence of colonialism or colonial countries, but still say they say that in the comment section, or maybe in their discussions as well, they simply say that this is because of some British influence, or these people are trying to insert a new kind of history into our culture or something like that. So what can be undone in a way, or what can be undone in a way to make people understand, to make even in academic spaces, not just people outside academia, but also in academic spaces, they're ready to bluntly strike it off. They're ready to don't want to learn anything from the true history that we people like you are trying to introduce it, or make them rethink. So what's your take on that, man?
For one, I feel a lot of pity towards them because, you know, if you have shunned yourself from knowledge, there's very little that others can do. But that's on a lighter note. But knowledge exclusivity has always been a problem in our nation, where it has happened on two levels, right? On one level, you have people being denied access to certain kinds of knowledge. For instance, ritual knowledge or Vedic knowledge, which was denied to large sections of a population. But we still progressed without those knowledges, because those knowledges in many ways were useless. No, you can't actually have an industrial revolution from ritual-based knowledge. No matter how many times you say, oh, the truth is in the Vedas, like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, or let's say a set of politicians who will attribute everything from nuclear bombs, to, let's say, democracy, to the Vedas. So on the one hand, you have that kind of people being denied access to those knowledge. I do not, but I for one, I'm someone who thinks that that is not even knowledge, because knowledge is something that either has to lead to social progress or it has to lead to technical innovation. Now, the kind of knowledge which was denied to the large populace of a country would actually neither lead to social progress or to technical innovation. So I am not sure whether it can even be called as knowledge. But along with denial of access to those sets of, what do you want to call it, whatever you want to call it, say non-knowledge maybe, you also have a devaluation and degrading of what was actually knowledge. For instance, Tachu Shastra. Unfortunately, because our languages are all very, very heavily Brahmanist, we do not have terms for, let's say, the science of carpentry or the science of architecture. All of this are called a Shastra. Now, maybe if you look at the Tamil pre-modern text, maybe there are also, or Telugu text, or Bengali or Marathi text, maybe we will find equivalent words. Now, in Malayalam, we have a word called Arivu. But it is very different from Jnana or knowledge. So, the knowledge that a carpenter has, it will be always referred to as either skill or Arivu, skill-based knowledge. And the knowledge that, let's say, a priest who chants mantra has, that will be called as knowledge, as Jnana. But what has practical use, what has led to technical innovation, it is these sets of knowledge which people have put to use, which have become very, very embodied, because it has become part and parcel of the ways in which they have lived their lives. So if you look at the embodied practices of several communities in India, you will see knowledge at work. But unfortunately, those sets of knowledge have been devalued and degraded, and only and maybe only labeled as skill. So we also need to question what has been understood as knowledge so far. And this knowledge exclusivity, which has happened along these two rungs, have also led people to believe that only certain kinds of people who look a particular way, who speak in a particular way, who come from certain kinds of spaces, those are the only ones who possess knowledge. And this is knowledge according to their definition. And particularly when you have knowledge which has the potential to disrupt certain ways of thinking, certain academic hierarchies, that is potentially dangerous knowledge according to them. But these are also sets of knowledge which, let's say, Thomas Kuhn in his Scientific Revolution would refer to as paradigm shifts. But those paradigm shifts are also what leads to huge epistemological ruptures in disciplines. And I do believe that we are in the cusp of one of those epistemological ruptures. And it usually happens when we live through fascist times. Now, whether it is Gramsci writing during the Second World War, or Mark Bloch writing about the historian's craft under a fascist regime, you would see those kinds of new sets of thinking which are not siloed, which also gives knowledge producers unique positionalities, unique standpoints to produce rupture-based knowledge. So and for a lot of us who come from backgrounds which do not align with the backgrounds of other scholars who we meet in the academia, who has been knowledge producers, what also happens is there is this kind of a friction, and I think that's very productive friction, because we learn a lot. We also learn how to format and how to synthesize knowledge in ways which, um, for the want of another word, which would give us exposure. Uh, but on the other hand, they're also forced to learn about things which might have been so far alien to them because of their lens of privilege. So once in a while, what some of us try to do is to go and poke holes in those lenses so that they can see a little bit more clearly. And I do feel that the younger generation of scholars, those who are way more younger than me, they're doing a great job. So once they enter the academic fray, we'd have even more manifestations of these ruptures. And I think that will, like Bordeaux has mentioned in this Homo hierarchicus, uh, human beings are essentially hierarchical, but human beings also tend to replace hierarchies over time. So that will happen for sure.
And Aman raised his hand. Aman.
Hello. Hello, good evening, ma'am. Ma'am, my question is that, ma'am, Ambedkar, about Ambedkar, that he says in his annihilation of caste, we should deny the practices of servant caste, different like their festivals or any kind of festivals. ठीक है? And on other hand, the question of fraternity. How the fraternity will come when we are denying the practices of seven caste, and on other hand we can cooperate with them. How do you see?
So I do not think there's a contradiction between the two. Now, the larger framework here is that of annihilation of caste itself. So one does not have to prescribe to, let's say, the kind of rituals, festivities, or very very particular caste marking or caste uh, things which might serve as caste identifiers, because that will lead to reinforcement as well as a reification of caste itself. But fraternity can be found, fraternity is something that is very, very I think it's very fundamental to human beings. That is why when you see another human being, your general tendency is not to attack. Your general tendency is to fraternize. So when Ambedkar is talking about caste in general, and throughout this particular work, Annihilation of Caste, he is arguing, his core argument is about the need to put to an end to the practice of endogamy, which is what, according to this work, which is what sustains caste. And unless and until you have intermarriage, and unless and until you actually have the intermixing of caste, religious, or whatever traditions, you will still have those silos. You will still have those watertight compartments. So in order to break those boundaries, um, in order to reach a space where you have castelessness, one needs to practice exogamy. Now that is why he argues that whether you have common cell practices of eating together, or whether you have other provisions, let's say, where the state looks at everyone as equal, unless and until you have intercaste marriages happening or intercaste sexual unions happening, you will not have an end to caste. So fraternity, now if you become, let's say, close relatives, or blood relatives, or affinal relationships, fraternity will emerge on its own. So this kind of a pseudo false uh, false barriers that have been made between people. It could be of caste, it could be of religion. Those walls are the ones that need to be broken down. Now, if you closely look at Annihilation of Caste, he, for instance, uses the Roman example, and then he moves on to the Greek example, and he proves that, you know, you had divisions in those society as well. But when those societies progressed, what you can also see is that because of exigent historical situations, they chose not to perpetrate endogamy. And it was because at certain historical junctures that they chose not to perpetrate exogamy, there was social consolidation. And that social consolidation cannot come only through fraternizing, let's say during festivities, or this false presumption of communal harmony where all of us remain in the comfort of our own communities and don't and still interact with each other. But there will be no social exchange happening unless and until endogamy itself is annihilated. That is a core argument, and that core argument is something that we need to revisit, and keep visiting time and again. If you look at in recent Indian history, with 8,50,000 honor killings reported over the last 5 years in India. What one sees is that you need to go back and embrace annihilation of caste as a text, and it also needs to be taught across the country. So it is not Ambedkar being against festivities. It is him arguing that these festivities are futile. And this idea of fraternity in the case of India not working without actually breaking down caste. Otherwise, we can only preach fraternity without practicing it.
Okay, ma'am.
Anyone?
Thanks.
Thank you, Aman.
We'll take one more question if there is anyone to go with the question. There are none to go with questions, and I would love to conclude it. And before that, we have an announcement actually. So, as a part of this Dalit History Month 2025 lecture series, we as Speaking from Margin are honored to host Dr. V. Geeta, a feminist, distinguished feminist historian, translator, and publisher for Tara Books. And Dr. Geeta writes extensively in English and Tamil on issues of labor, caste, gender, education, and civil rights. She will be delivering a talk titled Why Have Stakes in the Vernacular? Some Thoughts on the Language Debate. The session will be chaired by Dr. Shailaja Menon, Professor of History at Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. And this will be held online on 4th May 2025 at the same time 4 p.m. IST to 5:30 p.m. So we warmly welcome everyone, invite you all to join us for what promises to be an engaging and thought-provoking session. And for now, and I would love to thank Malavika Binny ma'am for such an insightful session. Like, I know it will be going to be a wonderful session because I knew her and I can say that I'm proud to to be completed. You can contact if you are if you want to go with any research, and she's open to any support actually. And the prime example is me, because I barely spoke with her maybe once or twice there, but she was very supportive throughout the conversation that we had. And I would also love to thank everyone who have attended this session, not just from many parts of India, but some people are from other time zones as well, including our Vidyasagarana from Speaking from Margin is in Germany, and same with Uttara, if I can say that right, Uttara Gita, and even Nitya ma'am, and they are from different time zones, like in different countries, but still they made it to this session. And thank you, everyone, and thank you. And I would love to hand over this to Vidyasagarana and conclude this.
No, no, you already concluded. I think we are just thankful to Malika for your time, and we are really hoping for more discussion in future with you. And yeah, thank you, Anvesh, for moderating the session. And on behalf of SFM team, we are thankful to Anvesh, Malvika, and other participants who joined us, and hope to see you all at May 4th evening, 4 p.m. Indian time. Have a good day. I mean, in Germany, so it's a daytime.
Thank you.